people in Argentina, in Chile, in all these places where people say they are not. And this is why this writing is very important to me, because it gives a voice and it allows me to, as a Black woman, to relate to the experiences of other Black people and to see how these writers bring them to center stage and give them a voice. So that. Now, for the students, the scholarly writing, as you know, you've probably been taught, all go through a rigorous process of review and editing before it gets to the printed form. I'm going to go to the creative writing now. I'm going to be alternating to a certain extent. So I produce fiction. My genres at this stage are prose and poetry. I've done 2 novels, Aunt Jen and Letters Home, and 4 collections of poetry. The 4th collection of poetry is a little book done by the UWI Press called This Thing That Is Not a Thing. My creative writing treats with a wide range of themes: family, womanhood, nationhood, this question of who I am, and so on. Several themes: sharing, both, or flora and fauna, or linguistic landscape, just a wide range of themes that can be specifically Jamaican as well as generally Caribbean themes. I do not self-publish. I want to make that very clear. I do not self-publish because I believe in the value of the writing process. And the writing process starts from when you put the first word on paper and you do your writing and rewriting and revising until it appears as a book on a shelf or an essay in a journal or a book or a book chapter. And so that helps us to enhance our writing, rethink different aspects of whether it's creative writing or the scholarly writing. For my scholarly writing, I have senior people for whose opinion I value very much, such as Professor Edward Baugh, who I usually, or friends abroad, writers who I know. Maybe I shouldn't say all their names, but I usually ask them, this is for the creative writing, to read and give me some feedback. So the whole process, the editing, everything, every aspect. So I don't self-publish, and I don't, I'm not telling people what to do, but I'm just speaking for myself. So why do I write? Whether it is the theoretical kind of writing, scholarly writing, or creative writing. One is that writing is such an important way of expanding knowledge, of discovering the world, of improving myself, my understanding of different aspects of human existence. So I learned so much about Jamaican migration to Costa Rica when I decided to research that area and publish in that area. I went to Costa Rica, did the research, met people, heard people who had never set foot in Jamaica speak Jamaican Creole, tell me about their rice and peas and their rundown and so on. So writing leads me to many paths, whether it is the scholarly work or the creative work. Through my focus on Afro-Hispanic peoples and cultures, I've learned so much about Blacks in Mexico. Today, there are people who will still look at you and tell you there are no Black people in Mexico. But I have been led there because of my research and writing about them, spent time with them, seeing the differences and similarities between us, reinforced the fact that all of us come from one place called Africa, but we were spread out across the world, and we've had different experiences and manifestations in our various diasporic communities. I write for that, to learn, to educate myself, to inform myself. The creative writing also leads us to do the research. We have to do research before we can accurately, and I use that word very guardedly, authentically is a better word, represent any aspect of or socio-political, socio-cultural reality in Jamaica, for instance, or the Caribbean. So I was talking to some students today and telling them about a figure, a woman in my novel, Aunt Jen, called Mother Penny. No, Mother Penny, I grew up knowing about Mother Penny. Mother Penny was this visionary who people went to because she was psychic. She could see everything, see into the future, tell you that you're going to crash tomorrow or you're going to get money or so. So even though I grew up knowing about Mother Penny, I didn't just go right about Mother Penny off the top of my head in this novel. I did my research. I talked to people in the community. I found a teacher, an old teacher, who, when he was at my co-teachers college, actually did a research on Mother Penny. And so he was able to put Mother Penny in our socio-cultural, socio-historical context for me. And I felt at liberty now to write about Mother Penny in a creative way, but also in a safe way. So I wasn't giving people some kind of stereotypical or inauthentic representation of Mother Penny and her role in the Jamaican folk culture, right? I love the word. I just love the word. I love language. I love to use language. I love to manipulate words to produce different effects and different meanings. I love metaphors. I think that some of the best writing, when you think of great writers, their writing functions through those powerful metaphors and similes that they create. Their whole set of all kinds of literary terms and so on. But I think I teach a writer called Julio Llamazares, and I teach a book called La Lluvia Maria, Yellow Rain. And that's a novel. It's a powerful book. When I talk to my students about how the book is like one long poem. And that is because so much of that writing is a rich compilation of powerful metaphors. Metaphors about the rain and snow and darkness and loneliness and death and so on. So I love metaphors and I love irony and the power of irony. And I always believe that irony is one of the most powerful discursive strategy that is available to writers, creative writers, whether we're writing a poem or a play or prose, right? For me, writing, whether I'm doing the scholarly writing or creative writing, is the best way to communicate my ideas, my thoughts, my creative wanderings, my creative, imagination. It's just the best way. One of the things that led me to write is that as a young person, I was extremely taciturn. I don't know if Carlin remembers me because we were undergraduates together, but I never spoke. I never spoke, but I wrote. If you find a book that has come anywhere near me, you will find all kinds of scribblings all over it. And I'm an indiscriminate writer in that way. Which is why I have to own my books, so I write in them. I write all the time. I write on programs, I write on little pieces of paper, napkins, and I remain a little ashamed that I wrote a poem once in my friend's mother's funeral. I sat there and the poem came to mind and I said, "You ain't gonna run away today." And I wrote it in the funeral service and I still feel a little guilty, but I just had to, I'm sorry. So I love to write, right? So because I was so taciturn, I did spend a lot of time. I wrote letters. I wrote so many letters. If you upset me and I didn't know how to tell you, I would write to you even though you were sitting beside me in a chair beside me or something. I would just write and write and write. And perhaps this is the reason my first novel was written in the epistolary genre, because I had been, well, apart from the fact that I grew up at a time when people wrote letters, there was no email, there was no Twitter, right? So we were writing letters and writing words and sentences and paragraphs, because we were taught to write. That's the first thing. In school, we were taught to write, and we were encouraged to have pen pals and so on. So when I came to writing Aunt Jen, that was a natural thing to me, apart from the fact that the broad theme has to do with migration and a young girl being separated from her mother and trying to find out a little about her mother. And so the best way to communicate would have been through letters. So we see her writing all these letters, trying to find out more about the mother and trying to keep the mother informed about what is happening in the village while you're away there in England, not paying anyone any mind, right? So how do I write? I said before that research is important to both types of writing. Reading is important. I read widely. Before I touch writing anything, especially for the creative writing students, I read widely. I read everything that is available on that topic, wherever it is, I'm going to find it. There was a time when Dijon was my research assistant, so she knows that I'll torment you to just find it. I need to read it and to make my notes and make sure that I'm confident about the topic and that I'm up to date. So if something has changed, I know about that change. So I'm not stuck in the past and I can't revise things to produce the most recent research on any topic and so on. I write an outline and I modify the outline as I go along. For creative writing, it varies. Sometimes I do an outline, sometimes a poem is just born in your head. And I saw Dr. Pollard there, I'm sure she will agree with me. Sometimes a poem just gives birth in your head and says, write me, and you just write. One of the things I know though is that, especially with any kind of creative writing, you have to be sort of flexible and surrender yourself to the writing. Let me explain what I mean. Sometimes you start off with an idea, and I've had many poems evolve like that, where I set out to write about a particular thing, inspired maybe by a word I heard somebody use, or a joke I heard somebody share, or an experience, or something I witnessed, right? And by the time I have finished draft 6, it's a totally different poem. So this is what I mean by surrendering ourselves to the writing, because the writing can evolve and we just become instruments in producing this thing. One of my favorite writers is a Spanish writer called Camilo José Cela. And Cela wrote many books, but one of his most famous books is a book called Pascual Duarte. Very violent book and so on. But when Cela was being interviewed once about the character Pascual Duarte, and he was asked, so did you know a Pascual Duarte? Did you set out to write about this character, about whom we read in the book? And he said, no. He said, I never have any preconceived ideas of who John is going to be, or who Mary or Juana or whoever. He says, I think of a character. I say, this is John. John lives in Madrid. He works as a writer. and I put him on the page, and then I follow him around, and I follow him through the streets and avenues and through the fields. Everywhere he goes, I follow him and I write what he's doing. And that thing has stuck in my head, and I find it so fascinating because it does happen. Everything that a writer produces is not necessarily the way the writer. Of course, it also depends on the kind of writing, right? So even with the book I mentioned before, that I teach to my first year students, La Lluvia Maria, Yellow Rain. And this is a book written by a journalist who does a lot of travel writing. And he took a factual situation where Spain went through a horrible period in the 70s, but especially communities up in the mountains, and people migrated. So that kind of writing is a little different, where he has to be, you know, he's making a spin on that situation, has to be faithful to it to a certain extent, even though he has freedom as a writer to make all kinds of creative spins. They're telling me, and I'm a very old-fashioned writer, so I write on paper. I can't compose on a computer. I'm just, I use a dictionary and a thesaurus at all times. I change words, I cross out, and so on. For creative writing, I want to bring the voice of woman very much to the forefront, because when I grew up, so many of the books were by men. All the protagonists. I love Jean D'Acosta. When one of Jean D'Acosta's great book, Spratt Morrison, was about a little boy. We didn't grow up seeing little girls and hearing women's voices so much. So as a very conscious woman who writes out of womanist and feminist, and I'm not talking about any radical feminism now, convictions, I want to see more women writers write about, maybe not Caroline, maybe I'm just crazy. Maureen Warner Lewis told me off one time because she couldn't believe that I was writing on paper. It's something I like to do. I like paper, and I like to see words on paper. Maybe, I don't know. But Dijon will tell you that is how I write. So writing needs time. Writing needs time, and writing needs to be nurtured and cherished. As Brathwaite said, words need love too, right? So I'm going to read, I chose 2 poems to read very quickly. I see Miss Clover telling me my time. I have 5 minutes, but I'm going to read a poem called Encounter with a Canadian Border Security Guard, and it's from the collection. This collection is called Star Apple Blue and Avocado Green. Ma'am, your prearranged permit is for 2 weeks at a university here. No problem here at all. You're pre-approved, ma'am. Nodding his head in approval. Thank you, I say quietly. After all, I have been waiting in line for more than 2 hours on this pre-approved permit. He continues, oblivious to my tiredness and impatience. Please note, you are not allowed to do childcare. Not interested, I say. Or work in a factory. He rambles on. Not interested, I repeat. Or work on a farm, or work in a hospital, or work in a restaurant. His voice is now a hum. I'm trying to block it out. He hands me the permit. Oh, and you're not allowed to work in the sex industry. I take my permit and say, sir, I am just going to sit in a little corner of a university here and do nothing, nothing at all, to be on the safe side.
Thank you. Paulette, before you go on to the next one, can you dip your computer a little so your face is a little bit more in the screen?
Oh, it's the camera, it's the web
the camera, right. Just down a little bit more. Okay, that's better.
All right. This is a poem that I wrote in rage after I went and took a photograph, beautifully made up, took the photograph, took to the British High Commission years ago, and was so pleased. You know how these pictures that we use for, visas and passports and so on, how they often come out in not too kind a way. I was pleased with this photograph. I get back this British visa and they have stamped this purple thing with, the English, the British sign, whatever you call it, the seal, all over my picture. And I was so mad. And so I put pen to paper and I wrote this poem. And it's called Her Majesty's Seal. Someone at the British High Commission did not agree with my express photographer that the smile I had practiced in front of the mirror for a whole half hour made me look beautiful, brought out my innocence, made my lips look sexy. He or she had with firm prerogative blotted out my face with Her Majesty's seal. The lion's head made an obscene pattern on my forehead. His torso covered my two eyes, and his behind sat imperiously over my nose and sexy mouth. At least my two cheekbones, my vain claim to African royalty, stood out on either side of his torso. Small assurance I had not been totally obliterated by the beast. It's a lie, I tell myself. They have no interest in my photo. They just could not catch me to brand my face, force me to carry the mark of the beast in my forehead. So they stamped it on my photo instead, blotted out my face. When I arrive at Heathrow, Her Majesty's imperial seal, in the place where my face should be, will be enough to let me, a former colonial subject, in. Thank you very much. So is my time is done now, Clover?
Yes.
Okay. Right, thank you very much.
Okay.
But you're not allowed to leave, Dr. Ramsay.
We have questions coming for you. Okay, I'm sure.
I'm not leaving. I'll be here.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Charlene, do I go on to Poet Laureate Senior?
Yes, yes, please, Ms. Clover.
Okay, thank you so much. All right. So Jamaica's third nationally appointed Poet Laureate, Olive Senior, is not only a poet, but also a novelist, short story, and non-fiction writer. At 19, she joined the staff of the Jamaica Gleaner in Kingston and later worked with the Jamaica Information Service. Senior later won a scholarship to study journalism in Wales and, as a Commonwealth scholar, attended Charlottetown University's School of Journalism in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. While at university, she began writing fiction and poetry. On her return to Jamaica, she worked as a freelancer in public relations, publishing, and speech writing before joining the Institute of Social and Economic Research at the University of the West Indies, where she edited the journal Social and Economic Studies, 1972 to 77. In 1982, she joined the Institute of Jamaica as editor of the Jamaica Journal. Senior has published 4 collections of poems: Talking of Trees, Gardening in the Tropics, Over the Roofs of the World, and Shell. Her short story collection, Summer Lightning, which many of us know, won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. Her 2015 collection of stories, The Pain Tree, was the overall winner of the 2016 OCM Bocas Prize for Caribbean Literature, having won the fiction category. Her non-fiction works include, The Message is Change, about Michael Manley's first election victory. A to Z of Jamaican Heritage, 1984, expanded and republished as Encyclopedia of Jamaican Heritage in 2004, and Working Miracles, Women's Lives in the English-Speaking Caribbean. Senior's most recent non-fiction book, Dying to Better Themselves, West Indians and the Building of the Panama Canal, was published in 2014 and was shortlisted for the 2015 OCM Bocas Prize for Caribbean Literature, winning the nonfiction category. Senior's work often addresses questions of Caribbean identity in terms of gender and ethnicity. Her work has been adopted as drama and broadcast by the BBC and CBC. Her work is taught in schools and universities internationally, with Summer Lightning and Gardening in the Tropics in particular being used as educational textbooks. She has won a number of awards. In 1988, the Silver Musgrave Medal. 2003, the Norman Manley Washington Foundation Award for Excellence, Preservation of Cultural Heritage, Jamaica. In 2004, she won the Gold Musgrave Medal of the Institute of Jamaica. Welcome, Poet Laureate. Again, we know that we are going to be enriched from your presentation. Please help me to welcome Poet Laureate Olive Senior.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. Can you hear me okay and see me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for inviting me to share International Writers' Day with you. This day is pertinent more than ever, with so many challenges to freedom of expression everywhere, and a reminder that the silencing of words is a prelude to taking away other freedoms, and we're seeing this happening in the world right now. I'll just talk a little briefly about how I became a writer, a little about my background, and then perhaps mention a few things I've learned along the way. I became a writer because I recognized from an early age the importance of language, and that language is ingrained in us as Caribbean people, and that people who have nothing else will always have a mouthful of words. I grew up in a Jamaican mountain village with people who were virtually all poor and many were unschooled, but nobody was lacking in words. The people who were most admired were those who could use words, whether conversation, speechifying, for wooing or weaponizing. People like the teacher and the preacher, educated people, used language formally, the rest informally. Among these were cussers, tracers, songsters, or storytellers. And even the way we speak about language in Jamaica suggests our consciousness of the dynamic quality of words. In Jamaica, we cut language or we chop language, and we throw word, which is an art form. And I'm sure people in other places have similar expressions to denote the dynamic, the fact that language is something you can almost pick up and throw. And children in my time were raised by the entire village on the proverbs and sayings that kept us in line. So if you walk down the road and you did not greet someone, an adult, even if you didn't know them, you were supposed to respectfully greet them. They would say something like, howdy, I'm thinking, I broke no square. And you knew you were reprimanded. And before you even got back home, your parents would be told how impertinent you were. And I have a huge collection of books of proverbs from virtually all the Caribbean islands. And what is interesting to me is how similar they are, because of course they reflect our origins, whether Europe, Africa, India, what have you. Nowadays, proverbs are hardly used in socialization, but it's interesting that they crop up frequently in popular culture, in songs and so on, even though people might not know the source of these sayings. And back to growing up, even in the schoolyard, those kids who had a good memory for word play and rhymes and rhythms and so on were as admired as those who had physical abilities. For me, this early recognition of the power of the spoken word aligned with emphasis on book learning. And both of these things encouraged me to acquire words of my own. Mastery of language, I came to realize, is what gives meaning to life, but also as a form of power, especially if you were powerless in other ways. So writing for me is not just about the acquisition of words, but of worlds, because communicating through language enables you to understand the world, but it also enables the world to understand you. I regard language as a raw material for my life as a writer. But for all of us, whether you're a writer or something else, mastery of language is also the gateway to life, to endeavor, to shape in professional and social relationships. I myself fixed my sights on being a writer from an early age, and I have never wavered despite the road being very rocky. I mean, if you want to make money and be wealthy and so on and have a fairly easy life, do not become a writer. Go and do something else. But the rewards are many. I keep saying words have given me the world. And my 20th book has just been published. And it's called Hurricane Watch, and it's my new and collected poems. So as a writer, I decided very early that I also wanted to use my voice to give voice to others. Let me hasten to say, not to speak for others, because I think that's impertinent, but I felt I wanted to enable others to be heard, other voices to be heard, especially those people in society who are not often afforded a voice in the wider scheme of things. And so in my fiction and poems, you will find many marginalized women, poor men, the outcasts, including those who are classified as mad, and children, above all, who are supposed to be seen and not heard. All of these outsiders are not just seen in my work, but very much heard. Although I've written all my life from the time I learned to read, my first story that was published is one called Ballad. And I always talk about this because it represented a breakthrough for me. Up to that moment, I had no models of Caribbean writers, or virtually very few Caribbean writers at the time I went to school. I was learning to write. And so, of course, my models were all English. And I found this very unsatisfactory, to be honest. And the breakthrough story for me was a story in my first book, Summer Lightning, which is called Ballad. It's actually a novella, it's very long. And I started to write, or she started to write, she just took over the story. A little girl of about 11, and she continued for many, many, many pages. And it's a story about adults. It's a story of love and death and murder and all kinds of things. But she wanted to tell us, she insisted on telling, even though it begins with the teacher asking the children to write a story about the most unforgettable character I ever met. And she writes about this woman in the village who is regarded as a slack woman, let's put it that way. And teacher tears up the composition and say, this person is not worthy of being, is not somebody you should be writing about. So the child uses her mouth and she tells the story. So it's her speaking, throughout. And to me, as I said, she took over the story. And it, to me, to affirm the power of voice that I could use, I could enable Jamaicans to speak in their own voices, to tell the story. And I think that voice, this is a little country girl of 11, I think that voice had never been heard in fiction before. Because this was one of, at that time, we were just beginning to publish Caribbean fiction. At the time, most of the writers were men. You hardly heard, as Dr. Ramsay said, from women, and certainly not from little girls. But a lot of my stories in my first 2 books are of little girls being faced or force-raped, like the child in Do Angel, in Summer Lightning, who confronts the Anglican archdeacon to ask him, do angels wear brassieres? So I certainly had a lot of enjoyment creating these characters, writing about these characters, enabling them to speak. And as I mentioned, I like to write about people classified as mad. There are lots of them in my short stories and poems. And one of my short stories is called You Think I'm Mad, Miss? It's about a woman, or the speaker in the story is a woman who lives on the street, right? And she's supposed to be mad. And she's at a busy intersection in Kingston, Jamaica, with all her bag and baggage surrounding her, as these street people, women always are like that. And the story consists of about 7 or 8 little mini stories where she, when the traffic light turns green, she goes to a motorist to beg, ostensibly to beg. But what she does is she tells them her story, whether they want to hear it or not, her life story. But of course, it's fragmented. So, there are bits and pieces. And the reader is never sure what is true and what isn't true. I'm just going to read you the first section of this because it's quite a long story. It's called You Think I'm Mad, Miss? You think I'm mad, miss? You see me here with my full head of hair and my notebook and pencil. Never go out the street without my stockings straight and shoes shine good, for I saw my mother did grow me. Beg your smalls, no? Then why I make up your face so? Don't I look like somebody pick me? Don't I look like teacher? So what? So why I living on street then? Then is who tell you I living on street? See here, is Sheraton I live. All them box and caroches there on the roadside. Well, I have to whisper and tell you this, for I don't want the breeze to catch it. You see the whopping bapping on the street side there is one old lady asked me to watch it for her till she come back and cause me heart so good. Me say yes. I watching it day and night, though in Sheraton I live. For the old lady don't come back yet. Quick before the light change, for I don't eat nothing from morning. I don't know is what, sweet you, but thank you all the same. Drive good, you hear? And so she continues, and she treats people, she curses them or she thanks them in reaction to whatever they do. But again, that's another example of using voice or employing somebody else's voice to speak. And I have found that a very useful technique in my poetry as well. I assume a persona, I become somebody else, I put on a mask. And this enables me to speak about painful things or investing characters with all sorts of things. Personally, I'm the kind of writer, I don't want to talk about myself, I don't want to write about myself. So a lot of what I have to say is disguised and appears in the voices of other people. I invest other people with some of the things that I want to say. This story, You Think I Might Miss, and quite a lot of my early stories employ the Jamaican vernacular in a kind of literary mixture of English and Creole. It's not strictly dialect. Because I want my writing to be read by people anywhere in the world. And so it's written in a way that a Jamaican will read it the right way and give it the right emphasis and so on and pronunciation, whereas a foreigner would recognize some words as strange, but would understand the meaning. And I just want to say here that I know this issue of the use of dialect or nation language is an issue for some people, and especially for young writers who might be struggling. And there are people who feel that to speak or write English or a European language is some way denying one's authenticity, as a Jamaican or whatever. And I just want to say that I regard myself as bilingual. I use code switching as the occasion demands, both in my writing and oral communication. But I want to make the point that we should aim for proficiency in both languages. In other words, proficiency in a European language, whether it's English or not European, but a world language. It could be Chinese, whatever, because that is our passport to a bigger world. But we also should be proficient in Patois Creole or whatever our mother tongue is. And not sort of do a thing which is really a mashup between the two, and not a real language. I'm just saying we should aim for proficiency in both English, whatever, Spanish, French, but we also should aim for proficiency in Creole and not be sloppy and lazy about language, because there is a lot of that. That's just my little rant for the day. So having just given you just a taste of my coming to writing, and I'd be happy to answer questions, I want to leave you with a few things I have learned about language and writing. First of all, I think, as Dr. Ramsay got across to you, any form of writing requires practice. If you want to be a writer, you need to acquire and hone your skills, practice, learn grammar, learn spelling, learn all those basic tools. And for me, it's been a long journey. The way I write now, which is with fluency, is not where I started, but I've always been conscious of learning. I write in multiple genres, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, children's literature, and the subject matter usually arrives in the form it wishes to take. I don't choose a subject, decides it's going to be a children's story or a poem or whatever. But all of my writing is guided by something that I learned from the oral culture of my childhood, where storytelling sessions were our way of entertainment at night. A storytelling session is a sharing, and it's based on a contract between teller and listener, which might begin crick, crack, or there are other openings in different cultures. The teller gives a story to the listener, and the listener responds in various ways, reacts, depending on whether in Jamaican culture, we would say they find the story sweet or to find the story salt. And if it's, and you know, you will know as a teller which one it is. And this made me realize early that writing, any form of communication, has to take the recipient of that communication into consideration. And I cannot emphasize this enough, that we don't always think of the person to whom the communication is addressed. I always think of my writing as a sharing, as giving something to the reader, because that worldview or that point of view forces me to stand back and consider how well I am doing, whether they would find my communication slow or incomprehensible, so it's salt, or easily understood, in tune with their own understanding or experience, and so sweet. And so always think of your reader. Another thing I learned from stories and storytelling is to think of communication in terms of shape. Every story has three parts, right? We all know this: a beginning, a middle, and an ending. But how often do we think of that when we're writing? I know it's simplistic, but I teach creative writing, and quite often, if something isn't working for one of the writers, I will say, have you thought about it in terms of a beginning, a middle, and an ending? Because quite often they haven't. They're just writing a story, writing a poem, and it happens. But they haven't thought about giving it that shape. And to me, that is an important of writing. Framing everything you write in this way will keep your reader following you in the expectation of something worth waiting for at the ending, something to take away. Another thing is to make it comprehensible. I can't emphasize this enough. Any form of writing, I see some of the most terrible things put out there by highly educated people, and it's incomprehensible. My belief is, and what my practice is, that simple is always best. And I apply this to everything I write, from a 2-line poem to a 200,000 book. And I'll give you an example. That book is Dying to Better Themselves, West Indians and the Building of the Panama Canal. And it's a big book, and it's based on many years of research. And when I came to write it, I had a real problem, because it's a very big story, both historically, but it's big in terms of all the component parts of the story. And it's a story about race, it's a story about migration, etc. But it's also a story that has a lot of, has a technical component, because it's about a construction project, engineering, all of that. So the first thing is, and this applies to any writing, I myself had to understand every single thing that I was going to write about, right? And that's also a good guide. You cannot write about anything unless you yourself understand it and have a good, and are confident in your knowledge of that thing. And so I was confronted with a huge complex situation. And this is where I took my own advice, which I give to students all the time who are faced with a complex big story they want to tell. Don't think of it as a big story. Find the smallest possible element in it and work with that to begin with. Work from the small to the big, not the big to the small. So what I did was I divided the story up into 10 chapters. And then each chapter I divided, or each chapter has 10 sections. And I treated each section as a story in itself, with a beginning, a middle, and an ending. So that way, I, as a writer, I could just focus totally on that thing, that element in the story. And of course, they are linked. Everything is linked together, you know, in the book. But I'm just saying that this was a technique. This is a technique I find extremely useful for writing, especially for writing something that's big and complex, whether it's your PhD dissertation or it's a novel. But it also applies to something small. But think small, think simple, simple is best, and gear your language, your writing to your readers, to your readership. Finally, I too want to emphasize that writers are readers. All the writers I know spend all their spare time reading, and reading widely and deeply, and when necessarily critically, is the best way of honing your writing skills, even intuitively, without your even being aware of it. It's a way of acquiring language skills, learning, and also a way of acquiring knowledge, because I believe writers should be knowledgeable. And so I read everything. I've always read everything from early childhood. I view words as my raw material, and I go harvesting them, because we know words have multiple meanings, but also you usually have a wide selection to make from many different words in order to choose the right one. I don't know, how am I doing for time? Do I have a few more minutes? Okay.
Yes, a few more, right? Yes, a few more.
Because I wanted to end reading one or two of my pandemic poems, because they illustrate how I'm using words. At the start of the pandemic, I started collecting the words that are being tossed around. We're all familiar with them now. You think some of which we've forgotten, but you know, like flattening the curve, and social distancing, and wash your hands. And these are all new to us at the time. And I started writing them down. And soon I had hundreds of words. And I thought, okay, I'm going to start writing poems and sharing them on social media. Eventually it became a book called Pandemic Poems, First Wave. And I'm still writing pandemic poems and sharing them on social media. But they're alphabet poems, like every poem is A for so-and-so, B for something, because I'm using the word from the pandemic as a theme to shape the poem. But as I said earlier, you must read, you have to leave your reader with some sort of takeaway, or else why are they reading this? Why you don't want to tell them what they already know, or you tell them what they already know, but give them a way of looking at it in a different way, in a new way, which is what poetry does. So I just wanted to read just one or two examples of this. One is a recent one that, you know, global warming is a big thing. Every day we're told the world is getting hotter and hotter. So I wanted to write about this. I thought about it, and I wrote this poem, which is H for hot, 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 because I was thinking those of a certain age will recognize that as the title of a calypso. I think it was Arrow, and it was very hot, hot, hot at one point in time. And so I used the metaphor of dancing and the beat and so on to talk about global warming. So this is H for hot, hot, hot. Feeling hot, hot, hot is not the best shot unless you're on the dance floor. In this scenario, hot simply means the most extreme weather the world has ever seen. What worries climate scientists most is a sudden shift in the beat from one quick step to the next, drought to flooding, heat wave to deep freeze. This cosmic dance won't end unless we get hot, hot, hot enough to take the steps needed to cool it. So that's an example of thinking about a word in multiple ways and then trying to put it together. And all of the poems in this collection really are about that, about the various meanings and uses of word. This one is doubly for waving, because we know there's been talk about first wave, second wave, all these waves. Whoever stuck the wave onto the COVID-19 pandemic knew what was coming. No one had ever seen just one single wave, not on the seas, not on the trees, waving in the breeze, not from us, standing at the threshold, forever waving to our departed loved ones over and over and over. Bye-bye. I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you very much for listening to me and allowing me to share this event with you.
Thank you so much. Charlie?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm not sure what a chairman is supposed to do at these kinds of events. I'm one of these people who absolutely never learned protocols, but I know that Carolyn has a very exciting session coming up. But before that, I'd like to ask if we can have questions from the floor or comments from the floor. But they both blew me away, and I am sure we'll have an exciting discussion. So over to you folks. Raise your hand. Use the reaction button to raise your hand, and we'll call on you in the order that you appear. Thank you. Do I see any hands? Yes, I see Kimberly and Samantha. Kimberly, you can unmute and go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. I have 5 questions. Is that a problem?
Well, let's hear.
Okay. How long does it take you to write a book?
Okay, who are you directing your question to? Dr. Paulette or Miss Olive Senior, or both of them?
Both of them.
Okay, so we can ask Dr. Paulette to speak for us.
Dr. Paulette, you can
Dr.
answer
Ramsay.
first.
Thank you very much for that question. I would say it varies. For me, because I teach university students full time. I also have spent a long time being head of department on and off, have a lot of administrative duties to do. And because the university says I must publish scholarly work, I spend a lot of time on that. So the scholarly papers take a lot of time for me. I tell my students, from I was an undergrad, I never took the night before to write a paper. I would have gone crazy many times. My essays from first year through to final year took me, I spaced them, gave them a month. And I would, if I had 2, I found a way of doing, parallel writing. But I gave myself a month, 1 week to read, several days to write the first sentence. I used to go through the worst teething pains to write the first sentence. I told Dijon the other day that I have since matured and learned to just write a sentence that comes to my head, so it doesn't take so long. But before, it took forever to have the first sentence that I would consider acceptable. So it would vary. An academic book, you heard Ms. Senior talk about how long her book on the Panama Canal, for instance, took. The academic book could take you a good 3 years because you have to write it in stages and, go back and do the research. It can take 4 years, it depends. The creative works vary, depends on the length of it. You may get to a point where you say, I'm going to let it go now. but everything takes more than a month, more than 3 months, a year, 2 years, because you're in this process of writing and rewriting and fine-tuning and so on. So there is nothing quick with writing. Even a poem can take 3 weeks, a month, 1 poem. I'll allow Miss Senior to speak.
Okay, Miss, thanks for your answer.
Yeah, I don't think this question has an answer, to be honest.
No, it's difficult, yes.
It's as long as it takes. I will
Yes.
spend years on a poem. It doesn't mean I spend all the time, but I keep going back to it. You know, so I can't answer the question of how long a book takes, really.
Okay, Miss.
Yes. Kimberly, let me ask Samantha to speak, and then we can go to Amory and come back to you.
Okay, Miss.
Yes, but stay right there.
Thank you so much. Good night, guys. This question actually directed to Miss Olive Senior, Miss Senior. I wanted to ask, with the poems, I know that some, you know, you have poems for children and poems for adults, and you were talking about the audience. How do you know that, how do you actually tell the audience that you're directing this poem for them? Is it that you use keywords? Or is it that you do it in the title? How do you know that to say specifically, this is for adults or this is for children, that this is the audience?
Well, it comes in the writing. It's, you know, when I am writing, I'm writing a story for children or I'm writing a story for adults. It's not, you know, that is a process. Does that make sense? Or does that answer your question?
It does to some extent, because what I'm kind of confused with is that when you're writing a book and it's saying that you're doing a story, and the story is about a boy and a girl, but you wanted to make it not for children but not for adults. How would you paraphrase it to make it to say this is directly for this audience?
Well, it's not paraphrasing. You as you say, the writer, are you writing a young adult thing? Is it for children? Is it for adults? You need to be clear in your mind to begin with. Then you can position it to that particular audience. But you need to know as a writer, because everything in that story has to be part of the process that's addressed to a specific demographic. And if you're writing for children, for instance, you have to know, is it a picture book, which is for children up to the age of 8? Is it a chapter book for older children? Is it for teenagers and so on? So you need to be very clear in your mind. So it could be that a story occurs to you and you start off writing it for adults, and then you think, no, it's, you know, it's about young adults, young teenagers, something like that. And you can change, but you must know who you are writing for. You must know who the intended readers are. That can't be accidental, you know?
I definitely understand now. Just one last query that I was kind of curious, because now, you know, we're in the 21st century. This is 2022. How do you stay competitive with everything that is going on now? Because we know persons are not taking up books anymore. We have our broadcast, we have our podcast, we have YouTube, Instagram. Now we have TikTok. So how do you stay competitive into making persons intrigued to want to read your stories or to read stories overall?
Well, first of all, I'm not interested in being competitive. I don't think in those terms. My focus is in telling a good story or writing a good poem. And I feel I will always have a readership out there. But I agree with you that, you know, the times are changing. I disagree that fewer people are reading. In fact, the statistics show that, readership is for books is climbing, though we might be reading books online and so on. I personally use social media, like I post a lot on Twitter, Facebook, etc., etc. So it's not a problem for me. It's not something I think about or worry about. I just get on with it and do what all the things I've always done. I do them to the best of my ability. And I hope that there'll be somebody out there reading me, but I'm not, I don't see life as competition in any way. So I'm cool. I take the point you're making, and but I think it's more for young writers coming up now. How do you position yourself and so on, in the world? But I feel that it doesn't, I don't think too much about it.
Yes, I'm going to ask Amoy to ask or to comment, and then we could go back to Kimberly and hear her second question. Amoy?
Hi, good evening, everyone. So my first question is to Miss Olive Senior. So do you think it's best to write in English or patois or a mixture? Like, do you think people locally, regionally, internationally would appreciate like my Creole writing if I want to write, in patois or a mixture of both?
Well, my first book, Summer Lightning, took me about 10 years to get it published, because publishers around the world said they love this, but why don't you write it in English? Because a lot of the stories, as I mentioned earlier, are written using Creole. And I felt that I had to be faithful to my culture. And even today, I use language, or my characters use the language they would use in real life. So if in real life they only speak English, in my work they speak English. If they speak only patois, I write a sort of variety of patois. As I mentioned, it's literary in the sense that I don't believe that I have to spell things a certain way to be, to show that this is a foreign language or anything. So to answer your question, I think you need to be true to the people you're writing about, to the culture, and to yourself. So what language you're going to use is a question that only you can answer. But I think if you want to be read around the world, then you need to find ways of writing that will make that kind of writing accessible, which is something I've tried to do. So just writing a book in, say, patois is fine if that's what you want to do, but it's going to limit your readership, right? Okay. So it's, again, like everything else, I think if you want to write, you have to decide what kind of writer do you want to be? What kind of audience do you want to reach? Do you want to write just for a very narrow audience? Do you want a larger audience? And how then can you craft your work to be true to the culture, but also to be accessible to a wider world? And that is a challenge of writing and, say, using Creole and so on. But I always say that growing up and reading English literature, we also had the challenge of reading varieties of language that were, very strange to us. We were forced to do that. So I think people around the world today are willing to make the attempt to read things that might be challenging, but there is a limit to how much that challenge is going to be. I'll give you an example. When I wrote my Summer Lightning, I didn't have much editorial work done on it. When I came to about my third book, I was living in Canada, and I had one of the best editors in the world, literally, and a big publisher. And she taught me a few things, because she'd come back to me if I use, say, Creole, not even use Creole, but use terms and words and expressions that were not standard English. And she would say, she never corrected or changed anything. She would say to me, can you rewrite this so that you contextualize it, or the reader that's not from your culture. I'll give you one example. In a story, I have a girl wearing a guzu. We all know what a guzu is, right? It's a charm. And so, but a foreigner wouldn't know what a guzu was. So I rewrote it so that the context would enable them to know that this was a charm, that, and so on. And so there are ways that you can get around the cultural differences by contextualizing what you're writing.
Okay.
But it's a learning process, like everything else.
All right, thank you. And one more question to Miss Dr. Paulette Ramsay. So since you have been writing about Black Hispanics or Latinos, like how many people now are writing about them? Have you seen an increase? Because that is something that I've always been interested in.
Thank you for the question. There is, I belong to an association of scholars who do research. We go to all over the world to find communities of Black people in Bolivia, in Chile, in Argentina, Mexico, and so on. So there is a significant community of us. Most persons are in North America, mainly the US, some in Brazil, a few in Cuba. The way we are trying to increase the numbers of interest, of persons with interest. Many of my colleagues in the US, for instance, teach many courses, different courses in the field. And so you get younger people coming up to do that. But it still is an area that many persons are not convinced, is worth doing. But that's fine. Those of us who do it find a lot of fulfillment, and there is just so much to learn. There is just so much to learn about the way of life, the history, the ways in which these people identify themselves and express their unique identity in societies that have totally marginalized them and tend to pretend they are not there. It's just very fascinating, very interesting. Okay. So I wouldn't say there is a prolific rate. I have people writing to me all the time because maybe they have seen something I wrote about Jamaican descendants in Ecuador or Costa Rica or Cuba or something, Afro-Mexico. So there's interest, but not, I wouldn't say it's just this very massive movement as yet.
Okay, awesome. All right, thank you both.
When you say you have an interest in it, what are you studying?
Well, I'm currently studying cultural and creative industries, but I've always loved Latin American culture, especially the ones about the Black Hispanics or Latinos. So at times I would read about different people from that era, especially the Jamaicans or of Jamaican Panamanian descent, Costa Rica, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I've been watching a lot of videos about them, and just always thinking of ways in which I could tell these stories to Jamaicans, to let them know that we have persons in other areas, and just to give a light to those Afro Latinos that don't have the voice. Right.
Well, there's research. There's Miss Senior's book on Panamanians. I have a lot of work on Costa Ricans, Afro-Costa Ricans, Afro-Ecuadorians, Cubans. There's research, there's a journal like the Afro-Hispanic Review, Palara. There are books. I have a book on Afro-Mexico, for instance. I recently did a book on Cuba, on West Indians in Cuba, and so on. So there is material there. Serious material, which is often more reliable than a lot of the tourist things that you get on some of these short videos and so on. It's the lens through which people see these things. And sometimes people are posting videos. I've seen some of the videos. Let's say, for instance, I've seen some of the videos of Afro-Mexican. And sometimes I say, because I've spent a lot of time in these communities. These are isolated communities where very few outsiders go. And I've spent like 5 hours on a taxi from Acapulco to find one of these places. So sometimes you need to be careful about some of these videos that you see.
Okay.
Some are good, some are less than good.
Yes, someone asked if we're recording this for posterity, and I'm very glad that we are. Kimberly, can you remember your other questions?
Yes, Miss. This question is directed to both. Dr. Paulette, how many books have you written and which is your favorite?
You mean creative works? You mean fiction?
Yes, Miss.
For fiction, I have 4 collections. I'm a baby writer too, Miss Senior. So when I retire, I'll go fully into writing, doing creative writing. So I have 4 collections of poetry, and maybe my favorite collection is the one called Star Apple Blue and Avocado Green. I think that one, and it's full of colors, and I play a lot with the blue, the color of the star apple skin, that purple bluish color, and the color of the avocado. So that is infused in different ways, symbolic ways, in terms of imagery and so on, through different poems. I would say that's perhaps my favorite one. And then I have 2 novels. My first novel is Aunt Jen. Aunt Jen is an epistolary novel. It's a Bill Downs-roman. It's about a little girl growing up with her grandparents, and her mother lives abroad. So it's a whole migration story, the effects of migration on the child left behind, the child trying to define and understand who she is through the letters that she writes to her mother. The child being met only with silence. So silence is very powerful in that novel, and the silence speaks loudly about that mother and why she would spend all her time receiving all these letters from this child and not responding to her. There is that Aunt Jen gives attention to the matriarch, the Caribbean matriarch, the grandmother, who brings up so many children left in her care. In that, we talk, Ms. Senior has talked a lot about language. One of the things I wanted to do with Aunt Jen was to highlight our Jamaican linguistic landscape. I really wanted to highlight bilingualism. And I don't moralize or teach lessons when I write, but one of the things I wanted Jamaican young people to see is how you can have this little girl growing up in deep rural Jamaica, but writing very good English to her mother. She's bright, she's articulate, but also this little girl can code switch like nobody else because she's bilingual. So that I plugged that in. I wanted to highlight that bilingualism. And then there are times when Sunshine does not speak standard Jamaican English. She has a kind of idiolect, which is, you know, I'm sitting and listening to Miss Senior, and it's so fascinating because it's also the kind of way we speak many times, which is it's not really standard, and it's not the vernacular. Is English we speaking kind of thing, as Mervyn Morris says, where we write words we are writing, thinking in Creole, but writing using English words. So there's a lot of that. That was a lot that I wanted to do in Aunt Jen. Aunt Jenny's studied as part of women writers courses all over the place and by Cape literature students. My second novel is called Letters Home. It's a kind of sequel to Aunt Jen, but it's an independent book. You can read Letters Home and you're fine without having read Aunt Jen. So I like to think of them as two independent works. And because I don't like third person, I don't like to write about people in third person form. Letters Home uses diaries, little pieces of paper that somebody has left somewhere and people have found, and letters. So that's it.
That's really interesting.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Madam Caroline Dash, question, comments? I see your hand up.
I think this student had asked about the favorite novel of both our presenters, but I'm not sure if do you have sometimes they say you can't choose between your children, but I was anxious to hear the answer to that one.
Yeah, I don't think I'm not sure it's a question that should be asked. Yeah, because it's like asking parents who is a favorite child. But I can say that for myself, my favorite book is always the last one that I produced, because it's usually so exciting, to have a new book and you're in love with it and then you move on. So that's usually my favorite.
I did actually have a question though. My hand was up about the whole business of using Creole in your work, both yourself, Ms. Senior and Dr. Ramsay, because I know that Aunt Jen has been translated into, I think, is it German and Italian? And I wondered, in talk.
Yes, and I saw Jennifer Williams online. She's supposed to be translating it to Spanish.
Right. So, so how do they manage? Apart, I know the senior mentioned the whole contextualizing.
Right.
But is that
right.
how they manage?
I was very fascinated when she was answering that question, because when I did Aunt Jen was published by Heinemann Publishers, and what they did was to send me a list of very Jamaican terms that they figured some people may have had. So they created a glossary at the end. So this is how they did it. They sent me a list and said, write the meaning, right, in English. So the same thing with Letters Home. Letters Home was done by Hodder, and they also sent me. So I had something like, every kin teeth, not a laugh, right? So they included that. When a person smiles or grin, it doesn't always mean that he's happy. Ben remind to be conditioned, just a whole list of very, very Jamaican terms that I just used. I just used them in the work, just wrote the way we talk, just inserted them seamlessly. And I'm happy they didn't ask me to change anything or so. With the German translators, I worked with the German translators. So they sent me a whole lot of Creole terms. Some of these, these because they were going to translate the glossary at the back, but they found their own words as well that they wanted to be amplified and explained and so on. So, and the translator would constantly send me things to say, I do not understand what this means. I don't know how to render this in German, and so on. I worked a little with the Italian translator. The Italian translator didn't do the entire book, so she had less to do. But I was very involved with the German translator. And of course, the person who is doing the Spanish translation is Jamaican, so she understands. She's working with a Latin American person, so she's the Jamaican
Okay, I
resource.
see her hand
Yes.
is up, so I see her hand is up. So maybe she
Who,
can.
Jennifer?
Yes, I just wanted to say that I was working with a person from Spain actually, and we
Okay.
have finished the translation. I've
Oh,
finished,
yeah.
yes, review, it's
Great.
done, and I'm just waiting to get an update from the publisher I had spoken to. And I am going to actually email to find out if there's any progress with that, with relation to the rights,
The permission,
the
right?
translation. But we have finished. And
Okay,
just,
great.
yes, so that's good news, I think.
So the
Okay.
book is going to be called Tia Juana?
Tia, well, I wanted Tia, I had put Tia Jane, but I am not sure yet. There are those sort of questions that I'm actually trying to decide on, and also what to do about the glossary, because we did work with it and trying to find similar concepts in Spanish that would work, but there are some things that we want to keep in the Creole and try to use context, as Miss Senior said. I thought that was a very good way of dealing with that question for some of the words.
Tia Juana might be very different from Tia Jen, though.
Yes. Yes, I'm just thinking because of the name Tia Jen, I was just probably thinking to use Tia, but
okay.
keep the Jen.
Very interesting. Translating, Dr. Betty Wilson is online. I saw her, and she understands the cultural considerations of translating. I mean, this is a very fascinating, very interesting session, because we're learning so many different things thanks to the coordinators.
Okay, thank you.
I see Cheryl and Dean's hand up, and I have a troublesome question myself, if I may. Cheryl Ann?
Hi, good night, everyone. Hi. I too must say thank you both for this amazingly wonderful, extremely useful presentation this evening. I just completed my first attempt at doing narrative inquiry as a research method for a book chapter, and made the submission. Now, the same challenges that you're talking about is exactly what I'm experiencing now. How do we contextualize? Because it's actually an academic piece, so it's not fiction. It's actually research work, but it is told through stories, a series of stories from the experiences that I have had over the decades in the classroom, in the Creole classroom. Now, I'm thinking, I don't even know where to start asking questions because it's so much. How do I handle this? Because I'm now in a position where I have to do the translation. That's the comment that came back, because so much of it was embedded in Creole. But the power of the actual research was teaching Creole students. So I'm concerned about authenticity. You know, how does the research work in terms of understanding the Creole language, the student who is monolingual Jamaican Creole speaker? How do I now get the message across about the methodology if I translate to a version of English, you know, or do I change the context altogether? Wouldn't it lose the substance of the methodology in that respect? I'm not sure if you're understanding what I'm saying. Any help?
I'm trying to understand. I may not be a good person to ask, because there are certain types of research methodologies that I don't like. So let me say that off the top of my head. The phenomenological type of research, I don't like.
Okay.
What you're talking about is in that line. And I'm going to tell you why. I find that it is easy to become too narrative and less analytical and critical when you do that kind of research. So when I supervise anybody, I tell them, I ain't gonna supervise you if that is what you. So I want to say upfront that for me, it's difficult for me to understand, to speak, because I have that particular bias about phenomenological research, narrativization of so and so. I already have that bias. I want to see a very scientific, critical, deep study, extrapolation of facts from your data and so on and so on. Now there's a place for what you do, right? And there are people who have managed to do it very well, because it requires a lot of skill to do it. I think I would prefer to talk to you about this outside of this session.
Outside of now, okay.
Right, so I can talk to you about it, but I can give you guidelines on it. But I'm telling you honestly upfront, it's not my favorite approach to research.
That is fair. That is fair.
Yes, but you can. I put my email there, and you can talk to me outside.
Oh, thank you so very much.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Well, I see my own hand up. I wonder if I may ask my question, because I don't see anybody else's hand. But no, I do see a question from Kian Prince in the chat. So I'll be fair to Kian and ask first. How do you determine which draft is your final piece for publishing? That's from Kian.
Let Miss Senior go, and then I will.
Okay. There's something that I call equilibrium, where I work on something. And then one day it reaches a point where I'm satisfied with it. I think this is it. But it's purely intuitive. And it's something that you learn as you go along. It's part of the learning process to decide, this is it. This is the final thing. I don't keep drafts, by the way. I just move on as I write. And I just keep writing, revising until there's a point where I don't feel there's anything else that I need to change. So that for me is the point at which I stop. But you know what? It's always good to have a second opinion. It's always good to have somebody in your life that you can refer your work to and say to them, what do you think? Somebody whose judgment you trust, because sometimes it's hard for you to determine that, this is it. But as I say, to me, the work reaches equilibrium, and there's nothing further I can do to it.
Well, I am terrible at letting go. So I'm always writing and finding something else and writing. Generally speaking, I have an idea that I'm there. Sometimes the characters just get tired and they're just not saying anything or doing anything anymore. So, they've come to the end of their story, kind of thing. But I'll tell you a little story about Aunt Jen. When I sent Aunt Jen to the publishers, and usually they assign you, they send it out for review to independent readers, they send their comments and so on, and then they say, okay, we'll publish. Then you're assigned an editor, and the editor will send comments and so on. And I remember I kept, every time the editor sent something to me, I would add something to the manuscript. And I remember she finally said to me, listen, Paulette, let it go. This book is done. There's nothing more to do with the characters or anything. But I just, every time I read it, I had another idea. And she just said, the book is done. It's fine. It's finished. But I don't know, as Miss Senior says, it's largely an intuitive thing. You say, and I go back to sailors thing, the characters signal to you. They let you know when it's done, it's over.
And we have Yashima asking a rather mischievous question of both of you. How do you process and deal with negative book reviews if there are bad reviews?
I've never had a bad review, I have to say.
I thought so.
You know, there are reviewers who are negative, but where I can tell they don't understand the culture or where some of the stuff is coming from, just from things they say. But I've never had a bad review, and so I don't know. I've reached a stage now in my life where it wouldn't matter to me, but when you're just beginning to write, it's devastating to have negative criticism or to have people demean your work, or what have you. It's totally and absolutely devastating. But I've been fortunate. And I think part of it too is that I never put anything out there that I'm not sure of. I have tons of unpublished stuff because, whatever I put out there, I have invested with everything that I've got. And I feel, this is it. I don't put out sort of half-baked stuff. And so the reception, to my work on the whole has been, there are probably negative stuff, but I've never seen it. So, but yeah.
That's nice. I don't know if, I don't think I've had bad reviews per se. I saw something online once. And the person said, this is a very well-written story. It's just that it's hard for me to read some of the Creole. That was an American. And then once there was something it was probably the Gleaner or the Observer when Aunt Jen was just published. And the person wrote a very good review, but then said, I must say, though, that one thing I find annoying in the book is this tendency that the person has to overuse. He didn't use the linguistic term because I don't think he did linguistic, but what he means, he was referring to what we refer to as the duplication or reduplication of the adjective or adverb. So if you read Aunt Jen, you will see it's something I used a lot in that work because I was representing the way Jamaican people spoke in the period I was representing. I don't hear it so much these days where people would say, I grew up hearing people say things like, I'm not doing it at all. And don't bother me. No come bother me. No bother come talk to me. Or whatever. So it was the repetition as well as the duplication of the adverb or adjective. And he said it was annoying. So as Miss Senior said, because it was my first book, I was a little peeved, but people who read it called me immediately and said, oh, don't pay him any mind. It's just, that's such a little thing, but it's such an important thing in the Creole, in the Jamaican Creole, that, we don't understand why it should bother him. I've never published my second novel. I wrote my second novel, big book, and I was so excited about it. I never published it because my main mentor, I would say my mentor, when I showed the book to that person, the person was upset. I wrote the book in a particular way. I was very feminist at the time, and I wanted to show how men are involved but not involved. Right? Men are there, they are not there. And I wanted to just explode a lot of the myths we have about how men are leaders, men are great, men do this, men do that. And I wanted to show that in the Caribbean, it's women who are carrying everything on their shoulders. Yes, they have husbands and boyfriends and what have you, but women do so much. And this person was upset. She said, why have you depicted the man in this way? How on earth? And this, I got scared. And that book is still sitting on my computer. So, that was feedback before publication. I've never had the courage because I figure everybody will eat me to say, you present a mini-man in this book? What is this? So I left it there. Nobody's saying anything.
All right. Yashima is asking again if Miss Dr. Ramsay, was any character from Aunt Jen inspired by a real person?
If you have studied Aunt Jen or read Aunt Jen, there is somebody called Uncle Johnny in the book. And just today I talked about Uncle Johnny to Montego Bay Community College. And I told them that Uncle Johnny is the person who is the truest representation of somebody I knew and somebody from my family. Uncle Johnny dies tragically and so on. And I was very young at the time, but it was my first death. And it's still very poignant. I remember writing that chapter, and I remember the very first lines very clearly in my head. We buried Uncle Johnny in the pouring rain. People came from all over the place to see them put down Uncle Johnny in the grave. I carried that thing in my head, and I think I wrote it in tears. And every time I read it, it makes me very nostalgic and very hurt and so on. He was young. I was probably just 4, but I've never forgotten that thing. All other characters are composites of many persons, different persons I knew. Aunt Sue is the little old lady in the village who knows everybody's business, cares about everybody, feeds everybody, and so on and so on. So all the other people are many persons in one, representing different people who peopled the village in which I grew up at a particular time. Some of the people are people I heard about, and I embellish them, grow them, or they grew themselves. Yeah.
Right. Well, this has been so exciting, and I haven't had the chance to ask my question. I wonder if I dare to, because we do have to move to a kind of winding down. It's not so much a question. I'd like us to consider something that Sherilyn might have been hinting at and has been bothering me, because when somebody said that the German translation wanted to preserve some of the Creole, I don't understand what that meant. Tell you why I'm saying. If you're translating a language from one to another, you're translating a language from one to another. And then there are times, because the Creole borrows so many words from English, we might mistakenly think that we are contextualizing, but the English speaker is still not getting it. And then there are some words that are not borrowed at all. They don't exist at all. They have no cognates in English, that you simply have to find the English cognate for. You have to find a word that English uses to carry across the meaning. So, and then let me take us to the original space that Ms. Senior started with, that circle with the storytelling.
No, I want to answer that question, Charlene.
Okay.
I want to answer that question about translation.
Yes. Go ahead.
So I didn't say the German translator wanted to keep some of the terms in their translation. I said they sent me, in addition to the glossary that was published with the original text, they sent me additional words that they wanted me to explain in English. And then based on the English rendering that I sent to them, they translated the German. Now, Jennifer, who has worked on the Spanish, is the one who said she's contemplating whether or not they should keep some words as they are. So let me say, as somebody who is a trained translator, that one of the theories we study in translation, Dr. Betty Wilson online can back me up on this. We talk about culture-bound words. So there are some words that are it's perfectly acceptable for you to leave them in the original language within that text. You can put a note and explain it or something, but it's quite fine to do that text. I remember I translated a novel written by a Black Ecuadorian writer, Luz Argentina Chiriboga. I translated that book with Dr. Anne Maria Banque. There were several words that we had. There were culture-bound words that we couldn't find anywhere. We searched every level of dictionaries, and we couldn't find those words. So we just had to leave them in that original Ecuadorian Spanish text. So that is not a problem in translation.
I understand perfectly. I understand. Yes, it's like we have kept words like Zeitgeist and raison d'être and so on in French. I'm from German and French. Right. Yeah, but in terms of, you know, the vexed question that keeps coming up, because the language activists are saying, when are we ever going to let our children learn to write their language in the way they should write, that everybody writes their language with its own writing system? When? Only Haiti has done it, and Curacao. After so many years of independence, only 2 countries have officialized their languages. And here we are with the literate, the luminaries, and we need that kind of support from the luminaries, because I mean, the children keep coming out half-baked, generation after generation. Only a certain small group of people, because they're already exposed to English from early childhood, move forward and can write in both languages. But they use the English writing system for the writing of Creole. So, you know, it's my militant question. It's not a nice question to end such a beautiful discussion with, but it's a question that will be asked, because every generation of Caribbean children are coming out and being disenfranchised in the school system.
That's a very political question that is difficult to answer now. I have my personal thought on the matter, and I think to a certain extent, Ms. Senior answered that question. I don't, it's now 8 o'clock, so I don't want to take on that.
Yeah, right, it's for contemplation
at this point, but the most I will say is that I support bilingualism, right?
Yes.
Right, so.
Right, I'm gonna ask, go ahead. Yes, please, Miss.
No, I just want to say that I support the idea of teaching English as a second language. Whatever the educators are proposing, they know best for education. But that as a writer, I want to be free to choose the orthography and so on and so forth. I truly have a difficulty reading the whatever that system is that is proposed. Carly writes in it. I personally,
the page.
Yeah, but I'm not opposed to anything. I am truly supportive of the idea that we need to find ways of making our children proficient in and bilingual.
Thanks. Elizabeth Wilson wants to say a word, even though I think she should be allowed to. And then Caroline will take over. Elizabeth.
Hi, I just wanted to say that as far as the translating is concerned, my absolute favorite book on translation is a memoir by somebody called Gregory Rabassa, who introduced the whole of Latin American literature to the English-speaking audience. Yes. And it's called If This Be Treason. And he discusses in great detail questions like, should you say Tia Juana or Tia Jen, and why he chooses. It's about his personal choices, right? And it's a fabulous book. It won the prize for the best memoir the year it came out, and it was on the New York Times bestseller list. And he taught translation at Queen's University and translated 35 Latin American authors into English. And he, I think Gabriel Garcia Marquez said, the translation is better than his original. So he's a wonderful person if you have questions like that. Gregory Rabassa, and it's called If This Be Treason. Okay, I don't want to get into the Creole business at all, because that could be for next week. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
This has been very, very incredible, this whole conversation. Thank you. Caroline, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. I am trying to share my screen. Let me just work this this out. I'm just want to end up with something about the students and International Writers' Day. Okay, having a bit of a problem here. Hold on. Give me 1 second. Okay, I'm not seeing it. So what I wanted to end up with was, first of all, to, of course, thank our presenters who so readily accepted the invitation to present and who has really kept us all enthralled. But to also say that Catalp'S, which is our association, Caribbean Association of Tertiary Level Academic Literacies Practitioners, a mouthful, but you know, we cover, we represent, or we are a community of persons who are teaching academic reading and writing and academic literacies across the Caribbean. And this community is, in a sense, still fledgling, still finding its feet. But this is the second year that we have celebrated International Writers' Day, and second year that we have had such a rich feast. But along with celebrating it and having writers present, what we have also done is to ask students to engage with some writers. And so we have asked our members to expose students to different authors. And this year we had 7 different authors that we sent excerpts from, and we asked students to select an excerpt or come up with the excerpt of a writer that they themselves would prefer, and answer questions like what they found interesting or not interesting, and how they related to it. And I should really be showing you some slides, but okay, it's late and somehow that's not working out. So just to say that we picked 7 writers, and I think there's some students online, and I want to commend those who actually wrote, shared their ideas on the writers. We know it's challenging, especially for the students who are the academic literacies. Okay, yes, I think I have it here now. Thank you very much. Charlene, if you could just put the next slide. Right, if you could go down, right. So these are the 7 writers that no, not that one. If you can go back a little bit, Charlene, to the right, So these were the 7 writers that we had excerpts from. Chimamanda Adichie, Maya Angelou, which is why we started with her poem. We used her poem, Still I Rise. Ingrid Fatad from Trinidad, Kai Miller, Vibes Cartel for his book, Voice of the Ghetto Youth, which he co-authored. Michael Holding's new book, and The Aunt Jane by Paulette. And the problem always is students in our academic literacies courses, the coursework is so heavy, and they are struggling to write their academic essays so that it's not always I guess, easy for them to break away and do something like engage with other writers, creative writers. But I think what we're trying to get across to students is something that Ms. Senior said, that to be a writer, you have to be a reader. And so what we tried to do was to select some authors across, different types of writing, Holding and Vibes Cartel having fiction, and then some poetry and prose. And some students actually did engage. Just a few of them from what I saw, but there are other of my colleagues from other territories online who, and other colleagues, not at UE, but at UTech or EXED or Church's Teachers College, that might actually have gotten the students responding to some of the excerpts. So I wanted to, before we close, just so if you can change the slide for me, please. These are the questions we gave to the students, and I just wanted to highlight two responses that we got. Most of the responses that I looked at out of Mona, the students really responded to Vibes Cartel. And I think part of that might have just been the shock of knowing that Cartel was had a book, and that, you know, he was putting his stuff in writing and not just, even though I think that the book is heavily, from my point of view, there's a lot of ghost writing because it becomes a little bit academic at one point, and he does have a co-author who is an academic. So if you give me the next slide, Charlene, we can just see, here is one. I wanted us to just look at two of the ways in which the students reacted, and also to think of the question about, are the kinds of reading that we are asking them to do. One of the students asked a question earlier to Ms. Senior about, you know, the currency, marketability of some of the writing. And, you know, I know that as teachers, oftentimes when we speak to our students in our academic literacy courses, and we say, what do you read for pleasure or for leisure? Many students say they don't. And I think what we have to wrestle with as persons in this field who want to help students in their academic sphere is, and to just improve their literacy skills and their whole writing and reading skills is, you know, in this changing environment, as the student said, with podcasts and social media, etc., how do we get buy-in by the students, or what do we need to do? How do we adjust to their reality? But what we got, I just wanted to read in terms of the Vibes Cartel, two of the responses of the students. So the excerpt we shared was from chapter 2 called $, or Hustle the Money. And the student wrote, yes, sorry, can you go back a second? Go back a little bit to the first slide. That was actually Vibes Cartel's, no, go back, right, back. Yes, this is the beginning of the excerpt we gave them from Vibes Cartel. So this is Vibes. I start the song by repeating, hustle the money, may I hustle the money, almost to make the message subliminal. Careful, read again. Haters, critics, read again and listen carefully. It's hustle the money, not steal the money, not take a gun and run, not start a Ponzi and con the money, just hustle the money. I stress the point repeatedly because there is a sector of society that can get a youth acquire ambition for financial success. It means that we're going to begin to embark on some unscrupulous or illegal behavior to rob people money. I often wonder why the elite of society don't think us ghetto youths don't want the same for our family as they do. Newsflash, we want to go to a big school, drive nice car too. We would like AC in our house. We want our mother retire young. And yes, we want to be rich. There, I said it. Vibes Cartel want ghetto people to be rich. Babylon. So that was the first paragraph of the excerpt that we gave the students of the right. And then if you could change the slide here now, maybe we just have time to listen to what one student writes. Let's go down to the next slide, actually, since we're just going to do one, right. After reading the excerpt from Voice of the Ghetto by Adidja Palmer, Vibes Cartel, and Michael Dawson, my initial thoughts were, he's not wrong. While both the author and I recognize and appreciate the need for taxes, it is hard to do the latter in a country like Jamaica. We live in a society where it costs almost 3 times the original price just to import a car. That was years ago. A society where families who are barely surviving must pay exorbitant fees when collecting what Jamaicans term barrel, often packed with clothes, food, and other necessities. If these persons were unable to buy the goods locally, how are they expected to find the money to clear them at customs? The tax system is rigid, regressive, and as the author infers, targets a specific section of society. The excerpt left me surprised, impressed, and intrigued. I was surprised because I've lived in Jamaica my entire life, but I've never heard much from Mr. Palmer outside of his music, which is usually about violence or women. To see him speak on this topic was not something I expected. I was impressed because his analysis was correct. And I share similar views with many of his points, including who the tax really benefits inter alia. Finally, I was intrigued because taxation is a topic I've always been interested in, and reading the views of other persons really allows me to better understand its impact on wider society. Okay, so that was just one of the responses that the students had. And if we had had more time, I would have asked if other students had read other of the excerpts, and but that's probably for another session. So Charlie, if you can just go to the last 2 slides, just finish off there. Okay.
Tell me when.
Okay, right. We're just ending with 2 slides from the last time we had, which was actually, we were celebrating the day of the imprisoned writer. Can you go back, Charlene? And 2 of the reactions we got from students gave both the pros and the cons of writing. We asked them to think about if they thought writing could be a metaphor for imprisonment, what they thought about that, or as opposed to liberation. And this is what one student wrote, and what we've highlighted in red was some of the terminology that was so negative. Writing is a form of imprisonment because of its restrictions. Word limits and content requirements make this statement hold. In writing, you are confined to and slave to rules and proper grammar. If you break these rules or write outside a set structure, you are criticized or penalized. So that was the first one. And the next one, which we'll end with. It is not a good feeling to be imprisoned. You will think that there is no hope sometimes and you want to give up. Sometimes when we feel this way, we can write down our emotions in a book. It will decrease the desire to give up. Whenever I felt this way, I used to write down my emotions. Recently, I stopped writing in my journal, and I realized that I'm more tense and worried about life. Conflicting views of students, from students in terms of writing, and I hope that this session will allow them, as they go back to those who have attended, and also our colleagues who teach the academic literacies classes, perhaps to find some time to once again engage with students just about writing and reading, even outside of the context of the academy, and looking at interrelationships with the types of writing that they do, but also to encourage them to explore, readers, new writers, different writers from those that they might read, or even to start reading those, but at the same time asking us to interrogate ourselves in terms of where students are, where their interests lie in terms of how they're communicating and the role that we play now in terms of teaching these literacies. So over to you, Charlene.
Right. Well, I don't think I can say anything to trump that, except that this has been incredible, and I'm glad for the opportunity for International Writers' Day, and these conversations are very important for us right now in the Caribbean, and maybe we should find other excuses to come together other than International Writers' Day. Thank you all for being here. We started out with almost 100 people, but we have 55 people in the room. But most people stayed close to the end. I was not paying close attention, but this is a really good audience. What more can I say? Thank you very, very much. Senior, Dr. Ramsay, it was a great pleasure to have you both.
Thank you. It was certainly my pleasure. I really enjoyed the evening.
Yes, and I learned a lot today. And I have three students from Guyana who are here too. I was so glad that they could come because their semester is finishing up. So I didn't really expect to see anybody from Guyana.
Thank you very much.
Yes, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Dear James, it is the body that I wish to write about. These soft houses in which we live and in which we move, and from which we can never migrate except by dying. I want to write about our bodies and what they mean, and how they mean, and how those meanings shift even as our bodies move throughout the world, throughout time and space. I am always being stopped. In New Zealand, in Dubai, in France, in Miami, I am stopped. The officers have looked carefully from my passport and then to my face, and all the time assessing me, sizing me up, and my body. I mean, the book is very literally about journeys, but journeys within my body. But all the time it's just asking questions about what does it mean to live in this body? Importantly, what are the things, the stories that happen because of my body that we can't talk about? And that's really the journey. It's a journey through bodies and silence.